Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, are we all grifters now? So Tim, what's a grifter and how have we become one, or are we one?
Well, the good news is for now, we're not grifters because we don't make any money on this show. This goes back to sort of one of the fundamental criticisms the Marxists make at capitalism or market relations in general. And one of the criticisms they get is the only things that get which gets produced is things for profit. There's also a thing the UBI advocates will claim as well. People weren't scrambling for money to pay rents or to buy food. They wouldn't grift, and different kinds of goods would be produced. So in general, what is the relationship between truth, if of course truth exists and is knowable, and the creation of content and money making? Content can range any from books to podcasts to YouTube videos to longer documentaries as well as movies. But recently, an accusation that gets thrown at all sorts of people is the idea of grifting, which occurs on the YouTube podcast, YouTube scene, and various other podcast platforms, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iTunes. There's a litany of them. I mean, in general, this sort of podcast ecosystem and YouTube production ecosystem. Famously, Dave Rubin gets this thrown at him. And actually, one of the people that I think Kyle Kaczynski stated that David Rubin privately holds whatever view which will make him most marketable. So you could view Dave Rubin as a sort of view marketing niche. He used to work for the Young Turks as well. Now he's sort of has PragerU affiliations from my understandings, which is an interesting journey to make. Now, I actually like Dave Rubin. I think there's something very honest, brutally honest and authentic about just being like a weather vane. So I've never sort of disliked Dave Rubin, so to speak. And Joe Rogan, who made this criticism himself, got a $100 million deal. So when Joe Rogan criticizes Dave Rubin, he got a $100 million deal from Spotify. And interestingly, some of his episodes mysteriously with more hot topics got deleted. And he also had to, Joe Rogan and Kate Force gave the some what would be called vaccine misinformation, and he had to give the sort of corporate boilerplate speech for a 2-minute clip he had to put out. So like, there's a certain money might sell your soul here. So there is some kind of authenticity there. Now there's other YouTubers that do a lot of money. There's left YouTubers that clearly make a lot of money. I mean, I think the BLM leader bought a big mansion, and the guy who sells the book, he sells services for now he's not a YouTuber per se, but one of his clear markets is giving lectures and podcast interviews and selling his book. I can't think of his name, but he talks. It's Ibram X. I cannot think of his name. But nonetheless, there's left-wing people. Sam Cedar, I imagine, is not poor. The majority poor, has lots of views. He also used to work for MSNBC. I doubt Crystal or Cigar are poor grifters. Poor insofar as they make plenty of money from their content. And of course, Stefan Molyneux and Jordan Peterson are probably both Patreon millionaires of some variety. Interesting, Glen Greenwald of all people gets accused that. Glen Greenwald has an interesting backstory. He used to run The Intercept, and The Intercept was funded by, I think, some centrist or left-wing billionaire, and he was given basically editorial free hand up until about 2016, 2017 when the Trump campaign. This is where one of the reasons why Glen Greenwald left. He couldn't publish things on like Hunter Biden's laptop. So interestingly, you get a lot of money thrown at you by some backer who says that you have complete freedom. You actually lose that complete freedom. So this is one of the interesting relationships between money making and truth telling, so to speak, is that, and speaking of one of the great truth tellers in history, Orwell died, fairly poor guy, so to speak. So it is an interesting relationship between money and that truth telling. Now, the Marxists, of course, would say, what we need is public democratically funding, or the social democrat would say. Now, I don't know if you've ever listened to NPR here in the United States with it, but the NPR is quite atrocious, and it's quite partisan. They did some surveys about it. I think 90% of their viewerships are Democrats. As David Friedman argued, they're not really a public good. They're a private good funded publicly. The main funders of NPR are Democrats or social democrats or progressive. Those are the funders of it. If they would cease to produce content in their view, that the Democrats wouldn't fund them. Now, alternatively, if they did Republican content, it would be reversed. Now, again, I'm not a partisan Republican, so don't mistake me for that. I'm just making the point. And actually, interestingly enough, NPR still has to maintain the pretense of it. So unlike, let's say, Rachel Maddow on MSNBC or Bill Maher or somebody like that, they don't need to, so the NPR hosts, and this is what makes them so totally hard to listen to, is they sort of have to maintain a pretense of being fair, whatever exactly fair means. So those are sort of what publicly funded just means. Publicly funded by whom? By certain, key figures in the Democratic Party or the Labor Party or whoever, the Tory, and in different countries have different parties. So a lot of the public stuff isn't really public. It's public, air quote. So to me, the public doesn't fund it. I don't think North Korea or East Germany is a model either. Now, I mean, it might, Kim Jong-un or the leader of East Germany might have art or podcasts. Would then be different types of media, of course. But this is publicly funded, but publicly funded by whom? So now, let me make one final point. It's also worth pointing out this grifting claim gets thrown at mega preachers of some variety. Your MacArthur's and your Joel Osteens and various others. They have huge followership. Now, I think oftentimes it's just haters hating. These are sort of charismatic, intelligent people who attract viewers. And these smaller churches or smaller Christians just don't have the charisma or the arguments or that. Now, that could be the case. Or it could be the case that they're just selling snake oil and they're tailoring message to fit the audience, which again goes into the tailoring message. If you tailor a message to fit the audience, are you actually being a truth teller? So, but alternatively, if you do it by ad selling, you can't offend the advertisers. And this is the sort of Noam Chomsky point he makes in Manufacturing Consent and elsewhere, that, ads and the advertisers sort of limit, the corporate press can't really go about outside of its advertisers. The subscription model also has problems because if you just get Patreon views, you can only offend your listeners so much. If you offend your listeners so much, they might leave or they might go away. So there is limitations of that, and there's also limitations of the NPR publicly funded model. And of course, so let's look at the world before YouTube and outside of YouTube podcast scene and how that gets funded economically. Well, MSNBC, Fox News, The Guardian, New York Times, these organizations are funded by ads or subscriptions, and of course, they don't offend their viewers. I mean, I don't think the New York Times has even formally acknowledged the existence of the fact of some of the Wuhan emails and certain aspects of that, as Alex Berenson points out. So they clearly don't offend their viewers with certain ideas, and they clearly have sort of dodgy funding models. They have backers, so to speak. So for all the criticisms that gets thrown out of Dave Rubin or a Jordan Peterson or Stephen Molyneux or Glen Greenwald as grifters, the people making the claims, you could just as easily say they're grifters. And Jordan Peterson might be a Patreon millionaire of some variety. I don't know that for a fact, but there were some counts of how much he was getting per month on that. If you just factor that by a few months, you're there. I'm going to say MSNBC or Fox News or New York Times, certain aspects of that, they have much more money to throw around than a Jordan Peterson does, or Stephen Molyneux, or for that matter, a Sam Cedar or Ben Burgess. So in this regard, I think YouTube podcasts at all. And of course, YouTube has its own censorship regime too. I'm fully aware of that. I'm not denying that. Google podcasts, they all have their censorship regimes, and they're probably going to get more censorious going future. Other models might come up. So with an overall, what do you think is the relationship between truth-telling and the market, or more specifically, the sort of podcast YouTube market, which is some ways free because no one really has to pay for this. Although in the other ways people do pay. People like Yarn Books get Patreon. So what is in the relationship there? What's with respect to like alternative forms of, or the old the old regime, the Ancien regime, the BBCs and the NPRs, as well as the sort of Guardians and the New York Times. Do you think this is an improvement? So Smith, I've made some rants on this topic and some of my thoughts on it. What do you make of the accusation? Are we all grifters?
Well, I mean, it's nice to have money to do stuff you like doing, so there's nothing particularly off on that per se. I think we should need to make a distinction about saying what you think is true and having to be paid for it, or just saying things that you think people think are true and so get paid for it. So in a sense, it's about honesty more than anything else. Do you put things out because you think they're right, or do you put them out because you think people will pay you to put them out? Now, of course, is it a problem that I suppose you have a halfway position, which is you put things out you think are true, but only the things that you think other people will like and pay you to do so. So you might have some more sort of heretical positions which may alienate some of your audience base. That's certainly possible. But when it comes to putting out things you think are true, I think you're more likely to get more sort of self-censorship on such issues when there is more money at play. I think you're more likely to get people to say what they actually think are true when it's a form of income. It's not the form of income. The extent to which it's relatively unimportant for their income stream, it means, well, if you offend some of them, you get less. Doesn't really matter. But if it's something that's going to pay the bills, then, well, you have a larger incentive to manipulate what you say in such a way that it's going to be audience friendly. So when it comes to sort of the corporates or the pre-internet era, I mean, did they really censor themselves? Did they say what they wanted to hear? Well, I suppose it depends on who. I mean, I suppose the editors will have done. And of course, when you're a large sort of newspaper or ITV, you have major corporate sponsors, and you basically are run by them. You have very, very expensive. You have very expensive outlays to sort of run as an organization. Then, yeah, you're probably going to have an editorial line that, no, we don't investigate this to some extent, or, well, no, we can't describe it this way. Although when it comes to newspapers, something to distinguish is sort of like the actual sort of on the ground facts reporting and the analysis thereafter. I mean, YouTube hasn't really changed sort of the on the ground, okay, what kind of happened sort of journalism. What it sort of altered is the analysis and sort of like context for information. That's what it's really changed. What is sort of actually happened, as it were, to a large extent is uncontroversial in many cases. I would say things with respect to vaccine and coronavirus are different for that matter. I mean, that's what was interesting. But I mean, prior to that, I mean, a lot of the time is what was said wasn't necessarily a lie. It was just truthful but misleading by sort of the sort of corporate press types. You know, that'd be the way you do it. And to be fair, that's the best way to influence people, so you can't claim that you aren't lying. But the main thing sort of YouTube has done is open the floodgates. I mean, the barriers to entry are a lot lower. Now, I suppose you could say for that reason, there's more people out there, which means more people can get what they want, and well, that just means you're going to be tailoring it to the masses. But the only question is who is your audience? I mean, Todd Lewis makes an interesting argument that he says that the socialist society wouldn't produce good art because he has to appeal to the lowest common denominator, so everyone can buy into and fund and think it worthwhile that society provides the resources to produce this art for the working man or for the average man, as it were, rather than just creating things as you were historically, say, for elite interests. So the sort of the aristocracy, and so it's much more definable sort of aesthetic or things that they want, and you can And also, generally the audience of the aristocracy is probably more sophisticated than the average man, or well, almost certainly in most cases, and so it's probably going to produce better art. So then there's a question of audience. Who is the audience? And I think this is with respect to YouTube. I think the big change is people who actually care about finding stuff out and learning and not just being partisan actually now have a way of trying to find people who will provide that information for them, whereas previously it was a lot more difficult. As in general, you can find books and things and actually learn things which were otherwise sort of gatekeepered and kept away from you. Now, of course, as grifting, is people going to be changing things so it suits their audience or their sponsors. But as I say, the extent to which it's not a major form of income is going to be is going to make them produce things that they think are true. And also, what I say is with Patreon model, unless it's the case that all your viewers have exactly the same views, it's actually a better model than having a corporate sponsor, because if you upset this corporate sponsor, that's loads of money goes out the window. Whereas if it's a Patreon one, a couple of the listeners stop subscribing, unless it's systematic, could be on the whole donator base, then it's actually kind of more robust, as it were, as a content creator to actually do what you want to do. Because, well, as long as like 95% of people are happy with 90%, it's fine. Whereas if you're working for the corporates or whatever, and you upset one major advertiser, well, then you're screwed. So you don't do it. So I reckon there's probably more attempt at grifting. I reckon people think, it's a side hustle, there's a bit of money, but also at the same time, if you can find people who are genuinely interested in providing what they think is interesting information. And also, as a side, loads of stuff on YouTube is made by people who don't even have any money. They don't have any Patreon. I mean, the whole sort of economic model of like, the public good argument, the private sector won't produce public goods because they're non-excludable and non-rival. There's no profit incentive, so they won't do it. I mean, taking that position to its logical conclusion, most of the content on YouTube you wouldn't think would have existed because it's non-excludable and non-rival, but it clearly does. So yes, there is a lot of grifting, but I think there's more space for people who aren't grifters and are genuinely interested in saying things they think are true and interesting than there were under the old model.
I'm first going to make a comment, then I'm going to ask you a question. What do you think of the merits? And you just sort of pointed out the public good argument about non-rival goods, which relates to sort of classic libertarian economics. But what do you make of the sort of BBC, NPR shows in general? I've said I think they're quite terrible, and I think they have their own kind of agenda with a capital A. This also sort of works with the sort of historical idea, the Jeffersonian idea. You don't want an established church, this sort of Protestant idea. I brought up John McCarthy, the mega preacher. There's also sort of thing that says you don't want an established church because every group has sort of an established base. So public goods, and this is the David Friedman argument. People can claim that a thing is a public good, but it usually comes out that things that are actually public goods, happens to have some sneaky. There's some sneaky clause in this. This dam happens to be funded by the farmers down there. The farmers upstream don't get as much benefits from it. Now that's just sort of a hypothetical example of a sort of somewhat unrelated thing about public goods. But there's many things in here: kickbacks, pork barrel type spending, and so forth. Public goods are quite sneaky. So when I listen to NPR, it's not agenda free. It has an agenda. It's to make the progressive regulatory state to look good. It's not that's. It's quite clear the agenda. Now they might produce good quality content elsewhere for other topics. I'm not sure if some of them. There's sort of argument that old stuff used to be fairly good, but this I think also applies to art that's funded publicly as well. Some art that's funded publicly is quite good, although increasingly as of late the elites and the elite taste and the I would argue are quite bad, so to speak. Interestingly, here in the United States, some of the really interesting buildings that are old are made by what was a time where basically private or semi-private, not private in the Rothbardian sense, but rail corporations, like all the stations, all these sort of Greco-Roman, railroad stations are all produced semi-privately, but are funded privately. The stuff in the 1950s was funded publicly, and it's all this sort of nasty brutalist architecture. It's all got torn down to the most part, or just a few token pieces are left. So there is a sort of private model creates actually more anti-fragile or long Lindy type stuff than public thing. And I think in my experience, I like the videos that are produced. If someone's producing as a hobby, this is actually how the Marxists actually theorize it. The claim is that people don't have enough time to create things, so they have to be always working somewhere else. And if they didn't, I think this is Adorno was arguing, everyone would be an Aristotle or a Plato. Now that I don't buy that claim, but I do think when people are doing it as on their own will, and this is actually interesting, what school forces people to do and learn things and read and consume stuff that they don't want to read. This is a comment we've been through on a number of episodes with respect to education. There is kind of freedom. People aren't doing this because they're forced to do it. This also relates to going to church as well and the consumption of those type of goods as well. So what do you make of the sort of public good argument, as well as, if people are doing it somewhat free? Now, again, over time, they might develop a salary or Patreon subscribers, and then they'll get, money from that, and that might change it. But I think Glen Greenwald just started off writing a blog. He's well read and liked to break stories and stuff. And that's how he got his start. I mean, even though I don't agree with all Glen Greenwald says, I think he's sort of an honest, upfront journalist, if they sort of still exist. So what do you make of this public good argument as its failings, as well as those other comments? Swithin?
Well, I don't have much truck with the public goods argument. I think as Patreon and other things have shown, there's other funding models, and people like producing stuff, and they're happy to go and do it even if they're not paid as like a hobby. I mean, and I think that they're in a way some of the more interesting people because they can say what they want. It doesn't matter. When it comes to like NPR or the BBC, which I know more of, I mean, the BBC does produce some good stuff. I mean, historically more so, like dramas or whatever, and sort of art things are pretty good. And also more historically, I think you had a group of people who were in the elites who basically ran the BBC, who had more of a view of, say, that history was actually a discipline you could learn about. It wasn't merely ideological. And they had the view that, like art, for example, there were things that were important because of the innovation in the art, not like who produced it. So have a much less sort of ideological approach to things. Whereas now, of course, because of, especially the upper middle class media types have all ideology overall, then of course it becomes as terrible as it does. So no, there's no reason per se why public, like taxpayer funded stuff production may not actually be particularly good. I mean, from an artistic perspective, you could make the claim that things are produced which otherwise wouldn't be produced because they won't make as much money, and that's perfectly possible. The problem is you just don't have any feedback mechanism to show that actually no, this is terrible. Don't make it, because you can't, because it's just using taxpayers' money. Now the BBC isn't exactly like that because you've got a license fee. I mean, but the thing is, if you have a TV, you're supposed to pay the license fee. So even if you don't watch the BBC, so it's basically a tax. So they produce stuff which is pretty good, but then they produce bad stuff. You can't really stop them. And then the BBC have been horrendous over a number of years. But they also still have the gall, though, to say that they're unbiased. And it's in their charter that they are unbiased, when it's clear that they are not in any way, shape, or form. I mean, an example of that, interestingly, was there was some protests at the Manchester United Football Club, and some of the protesters went onto the pitch and actually got a game cancelled. And they were very much at pains to point out that these protesters were a minority and were not representative of all Manchester United fans. This was because whoever was reporting on it actually had agreements with the sentiments of the protesters. let's just shall we say that such sort of relative even-handedness would not be brought to bear on any lockdown protests. Anti-lockdown protests. Yeah, I mean, it can produce some good stuff, but there's no. I mean, it just means that because they're insulated, they can produce lots of terrible stuff that no one really wants or is willing to pay for, and there's nothing really stopping them from doing it. I mean, that's probably the main issue.
Moving on here, so alternative funding models. I've sort of touched on that, and as far as the claim itself, almost everyone who gets any money on the internet is going to be called a grifter at some point. Again, we're so far immune to that, but nonetheless. All sorts of people from all across the ideological spectrum, the political spectrum, has gotten accused of this, for better or for worse. Now, again, I'm not against it. People have a service to sell. That service happens to be ideas or information. I mean, and this is in a way what churches are selling, although some Catholics might disagree with that. But if you're selling an idea of some kind, it's a service. You get that service. How that service gets produced. Well, you can do it privately for free on your free time, or you could do it funded through your viewers. And the sort of how you get the money from the viewers to the people is sort of a complex labyrinth process. And the strictest reason is Patreon. But there's also the advertising model. And one thing that irritates me about the sort of known Chomsky left anarchist thing is a lot of the Chomsky views, those are the views, sort of cultural views, that are created by the corporate press and to some extent the publicly funded. So Chomsky writes a book like Manufacturing Consent, and today it's somewhat annoyingly true in a way, but it's also true. Like this huge COVID nightmare for the past 18 months was drummed up largely by the corporate press, the sort of fear mongering, continuously being reminded they just become servants of the ruling class. But the ruling class itself at times has certain views that he has anyway. So that's the annoying thing. Another thing that's brought up is, and some of the founders of the social media companies, Neil Ferguson was making this claim. Now, again, Neil Ferguson is a bit of a neocon. Is a neocon. He's claiming that, many of these founders thought, if we just started Facebook or YouTube, now there's other more conspiratorial origins of these companies, that everyone would just swap recipes and travel stories and photos. But yeah, I mean, Facebook still has that. People still swap vacation photos. Although, interesting enough, that has sort of a jealousy aspect to it too. I think there's some happiness surveys that people who don't look at other people's vacation photos are better off, or things like that. So some of these social media companies, people thought that if they create them, would just sort of make the world a better place. But interestingly enough, some of the most popular videos on YouTube are like Alex Jones's 5-hour interview with Joe Rogan, where he touches every known conspiracy. Like that was something that was probably not predicted by the sort of left liberal founders of all these social media companies, which I find is quite interesting. I mean, a lot of movements wouldn't be possible without the YouTube internet types, podcast type scene. The alt-right, the Bernie Sanders movement, the libertarian movement, although that was a little pre-area, the libertarian that sort of formed. Although not entirely, but probably the Ron Paul movement, all those things, they're very much products of the internet era, for better or for worse. So I do think there's an interesting way in which the opening up of media to very low entry costs, in the same way the destruction of the Catholic Church caused thousands of Protestant churches to form, you get all sort of more niche tastes, like and this is where the sort of there's sort of lunatic books. There was the lady who ran for president of the Democrats. She's like a self-help guru, and then you also have other right-wing self-help gurus and stuff. So all these sort of formats and sort of the conspiracy theories. So I think it's interesting. I don't much care for a consensus take or sort of view, so to speak. But I do think it's interesting that there was sort of this sort of liberal new atheist idea that if you just gave everyone the freedom to create whatever content, they would actually just gravitate toward the corporate content, which actually, if anything, has been the opposite case. My suspect is that certain channels on YouTube, if Alex Jones was allowed on YouTube, he'd probably have 100 million views if they didn't stifle him or if they gave him the same treatment that Stephen Colbert gets, you'd be centerfold every time. I mean, it has to be. So I do think overall it has been an improvement, the sort of podcast YouTube scene than versus 20 years ago. This is one of the areas which I disagree with the normie conservatives. Like, in the 1960s, you had much less freedom of communication. Now, there's other areas that might have been upside, but you had 4 channels, you had a certain monopoly on newspapers. Now, the newspapers might have been more free, more independent with respect to each other, but I still view the sort of recent invention of the internet et al. To be an improvement, especially. But I'm willing to hear arguments against it, so forth. So then, do you have any arguments to make against? For do you think this sort of Patreon, YouTube podcast exposure scene of the past 20 years has been a benefit, so to speak? I certainly think it's been a benefit. I mean, I spend a significant amount of time driving. Yeah. But what do you make of this with them?
Oh, it's clearly been a benefit. I mean, there's so much more content out there. Obviously, there's lots of terrible stuff, but filter it out. Find the stuff is interesting. I mean, it's the same with the internet in general. I mean, there's loads of terrible stuff on the internet, but there's loads of good stuff. And trying to get access to the good stuff beforehand was very, very, very difficult. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. Even trying to get hold of published books was hard work. Like, and these are sort of like, dense academic tomes. They're not spicy sort of works, as it were. But they're just blooming difficult to get hold of. So, yeah, the worst is probably worse, but is the better possibly? It's just a case of trying to navigate it. I see podcasts being far better. I mean, I suppose you could then set the argument against, you get into echo chambers. I suppose that would be the claim that people could get into echo chambers, but I mean, the corporate press is an echo chamber. I mean, it's just moderate. It's a moderate echo chamber, inverted commas, so therefore socially acceptable. I mean, the number of people who are genuinely interested in finding out the truth about things has probably always been relatively little. So the fact that people get stuck in more sort of extreme echo chambers isn't really much of an issue. Then I suppose you could say, well, yes, but this is going to cause social problems. Well, that's just because you've got a large state and they should be split down into small ones so people can live with people they like. So, yeah, I see very few downsides to the podcast scene.
It could be that this is an interesting relationship with technology. It could be that the large states are only possible with large, somewhat unified corporate press, hierarchies. Interestingly enough, large states, there's a book called The Discovery of France, and I think it's called The Pursuit of Italy. And actually in the United States, it used to be known as these United States, and not as a conglomerate. It's just a conglomerate of different societies. So it could be the case that, a usually unified society, it only exists because of the corporate press. And actually, this is one of the ways in which I think YouTube et al. Has shattered that. Now, again, YouTube has its own censorship regime. I'm fully aware of that. But I think it's an improvement. Some of them, some of the things I don't necessarily object to, but that's just the nature of the beast, so to speak. And I'm fully advocate of alternative funds. And again, they might shut them down. That's also could happen. But in the Lincoln, during the U.S. Civil War, as Tom Lorenzo points out, that newspapers that ran certain articles weren't allowed to be run in the mail. And since they had a de facto monopoly on the mail, that you were just sort of the state sort of took you out of circulation more or less indirectly. So what do you make of those comments? And then that's it for my comments. I think the grifting accusation is kind of lame in a way, because I think it's one of those things that might be true of everyone who's big enough on the internet. If something's true of almost everyone, you can't really sort of single out and say, oh well, you're not, who isn't a grifter of the big podcast authors. They all sort of have money claims, and I don't think the sort of public models are any different either. That's another thing I don't think is any different. Tenured university professors are increasingly coward-like anyway. So things that normally give people sort of freedom in a sense, they actually do the opposite. They're actually more cowardly. So those are my overall comments. Swithin, do you have any final comments to wrap it up? Very interesting topic here.
All I'd say is, I mean, I suppose what people ideally want is somebody who has the truth at their heart and will be happy to fund anybody who says something interesting and won't sort of censor on anything other than an objective quality basis and produce works. But I mean, whether that guy's ever going to exist is minimal, especially if he's got like free money to hand from other people who don't want to give it to him. Then that's kind of going to be, that's not a particularly great incentive structure. As I say, I think the incentive structure of lots of people giving money to individuals I think are interesting, or even classical patronage. Rich guy, you like your work, here's some money, do more of it. I mean, I think that's much more likely to get new ideas, better ideas, truthful ideas than a huge bureaucratic corporate entity, which basically universities have turned into these days. So, but yeah, is everyone on the internet want to be a grifter? Well, fine, yeah, but who isn't? I mean, it's such a trivial statement in most cases, unless you can point to evidence that they're just merely tailoring what they think on sort of like information sort of analysis sort of shows which are aimed to find out the truth of things. If it's the case that they deliberately don't do that and do what sells, well, that's a grift and that's a problem. Unless there's evidence that is actually what they're doing, then saying that they're a grifter is just trivial or just an ad hominem, really. That's all I'd finish with, really. Just now, I'd thank everyone for listening. If you would like this podcast, please share and subscribe to us. The more subscribers we get on YouTube and on Podbean, the higher we get up in the search rankings, and the more people can listen to this and then hopefully give us money. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.